In a town where danger roams as freely as the wild mustangs, a daring little girl named Emma makes a bet she can tame the most untamable creature the world has ever known, a wild mustang named Rogue. But when she steps into the pen, no one can predict the powerful connection that forms between them. What happens next will shatter expectations, touch hearts, and change everything for Emma and the town forever. The sun beat down on Summit Hollow, the dry dust swirling in the air as the townsfolk gathered around the makeshift pen in the square. The whispers of the ranchers filled the air, sharp and disapproving, as they eyed Rogue, an untamed mustang who had become the stuff of legends. His wild eyes burned with defiance, his coat as black as night, and his presence alone seemed to hold the entire town in a state of uneasy awe. Emma, small and quiet, stood at the edge of the crowd watching intently. She was just a girl, barely 10, with wild curls that bounced in the wind, and a spark in her eyes that few ever saw. The ranchers were talking in low voices, their words carrying a weight of superiority that made her stomach twist with frustration. "He'll never be broken," one of the ranchers muttered, adjusting his hat. "He's got too much fight in him. Ain't no man, let alone a boy or girl, gonna tame him." Emma's ears pricked up. She knew they were talking about Rogue, and she could feel the tension in the air. The Mustang was a symbol of everything the town revered: power, control, and dominance. He was feared, revered, and beyond reach. As the murmurs grew louder, Emma overheard a conversation between two ranchers standing near her. "I'll bet $10 someone can tame him in under 10 minutes, one of them said with a smirk. "I'm calling it now. Whoever does gets the title of Ranch King." The crowd erupted in laughter, the idea of anyone being able to tame the feral beast nothing short of ridiculous. Without thinking, Emma stepped forward, her voice carrying above the chuckles of the men. "I'll do it," she declared, her words sharp and sure, cutting through the noise like a blade. "I'll tame him in under 10 minutes." The laughter died immediately, replaced by stunned silence. The ranchers stared at her in disbelief, as if the idea of a little girl attempting the impossible was some kind of joke. "You?" one of the men sneered, his face twisting with amusement. "You think you can tame him? This isn't some game. Rogue's no pet." Emma stood firm, her small hands balled into fists, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. "I can do it," she repeated, her voice steady. "I'll show you." The crowd fell into an uneasy quiet, the challenge hanging in the air like a dare that no one expected to be answered. Emma wasn't doing it for the title or the attention. She didn't care about the bet. She just couldn't stand watching the Mustang being treated like a trophy, something to be dominated, when all he needed was someone who understood him. And so, in that single moment, Emma made a bet that would change everything, one she couldn't back out of, no matter how wild or impossible it seemed. Rogue was no ordinary Mustang. His name alone struck fear in the hearts of the ranchers, who spoke of him in hushed tones, as though he were a force of nature, a storm that could never be tamed. Born on the vast, untamed lands beyond Summit Hollow, he had grown wild and free, untouched by the hands of man. From the moment he was captured, it was clear that breaking him would be no easy task. The first attempt to break Rogue had been years ago. A seasoned cowboy, known for his skill and bravery, had tried to rope him in the wild. It had taken days to catch the Mustang, but the moment the cowboy had thrown the rope over his neck, it was clear who was in charge. Rogue had bolted, his hooves thundering against the earth as the cowboy was tossed from his back, crashing into the dirt. The crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle had been stunned into silence. The cowboy was carried off the field, humiliated, his pride shattered along with his bones. After that, many tried. A group of ranchers had teamed up, their ropes and lassos ready, determined to conquer Rogue once and for all. The Mustang fought back like a whirlwind. He reared up, kicking, and when the men tried to corral him, he spun with a wild energy that was impossible to contain. The ropes broke. The whips were useless. He had defied them all time and time again, until there was nothing left but frustration and defeat. Rogue's legend grew with each failed attempt, the wild spirit of the land captured in his untamable eyes. To the townsfolk, Rogue was a symbol of the land's fierce independence. He represented everything they admired: strength, freedom, and the refusal to be controlled. No matter how much they tried to subdue him, he always found a way to break free, like the mountains and rivers that could never be bound by man's hand. For some, Rogue was a challenge that could not be ignored, a beast to be conquered. But for others, he was a reminder of everything that was beyond their reach. Emma, however, saw something different. She didn't view Rogue as a beast to be broken, but as a creature who needed understanding, not force. While the town saw only wildness, she saw fear, a fear that had been cultivated over time, through harsh hands and broken promises. She wasn't naive, she knew the odds were against her, but something inside her stirred. The same belief that had always guided her, patience, gentleness, trust, was now her weapon. In the midst of the crowd's doubts and the weight of the town's history, Emma's quiet resolve grew stronger. She could see past the violence, past the fear, and into the heart of the wild Mustang that had always fought for freedom. And she was ready to fight alongside him, not with force, but with the one thing that had always worked in her life: patience. The air was thick with heat and tension as Emma stood by the pen, her eyes locked on Rogue. The Mustang was pacing, his hooves kicking up the dry earth in sharp, angry strikes. His coat shimmered under the midday sun, a dark silhouette of muscle and fire. He was beautiful, in a way that both terrified and mesmerized her. His gaze, wild and unyielding, cut through the distance between them like a knife. Emma felt the weight of it, the fury in his eyes, the challenge in his stance. Yet, there was something else there, something she couldn't quite place. Rogue's body was a storm of raw energy, every muscle taut and ready to fight. But his eyes, they were different. Beneath the defiance, beneath the rage, Emma saw something softer, something vulnerable, a flicker of fear, buried deep under years of mistrust and hurt. The Mustang wasn't just angry. He was scared. A surge of compassion filled Emma's chest, so strong it nearly knocked the air from her lungs. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of animals who had been broken, pushed too far, hurt by hands that were supposed to protect them. She could feel the weight of his pain, the way he had been forced into this pen, his spirit dragged into submission. The people who had come before her hadn't seen it. They hadn't looked deep enough into his soul. But Emma did. "Hey there," she whispered, stepping closer to the pen, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." Her words hung in the air, fragile and quiet, but somehow they felt like the truth. The Mustang's eyes flickered toward her, his breath coming in sharp, heavy gasps. He stopped moving, just for a moment, as though considering her. But then, with a snort, he started pacing again, his gaze darting to the crowd that had gathered, eyes full of judgment and doubt. The townsfolk were already laughing. Emma could hear their mocking whispers behind her, the sneers and chuckles that filled the air like poison. "She's out of her mind," someone said. "A little girl thinking she can tame Rogue. This is gonna be a show." The ridicule stung, but Emma didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, and it only strengthened her resolve. Her heart ached for Rogue. She didn't know why, but she felt an inexplicable connection to him, something deeper than just a shared space in the pen. She believed they could understand each other. He wasn't a beast to be broken, he was a creature in pain, just like she had been before, misunderstood and forced to fight. "I'm not giving up on you," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. She felt his gaze on her once again, and this time it wasn't filled with fury. It was something else, a quiet curiosity, a spark, and for the first time Emma felt hope rise in her chest. They would find their way together. The day of the challenge arrived, heavy with the weight of the town's expectations. Summit Hollow seemed to hold its breath as the crowd gathered, drawn by the spectacle that was about to unfold. The air was thick with dust and anticipation, the sun casting a harsh light over the dusty square where the pen stood. Rogue, the wild Mustang, paced inside, his muscles rippling under his coat, his eyes flashing with the kind of fury that had made him infamous. He was a living legend now, untamable, unconquerable. But in the midst of the whispering crowd, Emma stood alone at the edge of the pen, the soft rustle of her dress barely audible over the noise. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her jaw set in quiet determination. She could feel the eyes on her, skepticism, mockery, and something else too, something she couldn't place. It was a weight that pressed down on her chest, a challenge she had never asked for but couldn't walk away from. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone, but the eyes of Summit Hollow were fixed on her, and that made her feel the full force of their doubt. The men around the pen were making bets, their laughter mingling with the sound of coins clinking as they tossed their wagers into a makeshift pile. "I'll bet $50 she'll be crying within 5 minutes. One of the ranchers called out, his voice filled with derision. "Ain't no way a girl's gonna break that horse." The others chuckled, nodding in agreement. "You're asking for trouble, kid," another voice sneered, just loud enough for Emma to hear. "This isn't a game. Rogue's a beast." Emma didn't look back at them. She didn't need to. Their words, harsh and filled with ridicule, weren't meant for her. They were meant for the idea of a little girl daring to do what none of them could. Her grandfather, Walter, stood off to the side, his weathered face tight with concern. His hands were resting on the gate, his eyes fixed on her with a quiet urgency that she could feel from across the pen. He wasn't like the others. He knew what Rogue could do. He had seen the damage the Mustang had left in his wake. And yet, when his gaze met hers, there was more than just worry. There was pride, too. "Emma," Walter called, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to do this. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You've got a whole life ahead of you. Don't risk it on this." Emma's heart twisted, but she didn't back down. Her grandfather didn't understand, not in the way she did. This wasn't about proving herself, it was about Rogue, and no one else had ever seen that. "I'm doing this for him, Grandpa," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her chest. "Not for them." She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the Mustang, and stepped forward. The challenge was set, the crowd watching, waiting for her failure. Emma didn't need their approval. She just needed the courage to move forward, into the unknown. And with one last glance at her grandfather, she stepped into the pen. Emma stepped into the pen, her feet light on the dry earth, her breath steady in her chest. The crowd erupted in laughter, their voices sharp and mocking. It was impossible not to hear the snickers, the bets being called, the low hum of disbelief that filled the air. "She's going to get herself hurt," one rancher muttered. "Let's see how long she lasts." Rogue stood at the far end of the pen, his wild eyes fixed on her. His body was a coiled spring of muscle and fury, and the tension in the air was so thick that it almost crackled. Emma could feel the force of his gaze, the challenge he presented. He didn't belong here, trapped in this pen for their amusement. She knew that, and something inside her stirred. With nothing but a soft voice and open hands, Emma approached him slowly. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't here to fight him. She wasn't here to break him. She was here to understand him. "Easy, Rogue," she whispered, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just here to help." The words were barely out of her mouth when Rogue reared up, his hooves striking the air with a power that shook the ground beneath them. His wild mane whipped around his face like a storm, and the sound of his hooves against the ground was deafening. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified, and he was making sure everyone knew it. The crowd's laughter died down as Rogue's fury became palpable. The ropes that held him were stretched tight, the force of his thrashing nearly enough to break them. But Emma didn't flinch. She didn't move back. Her hands remained outstretched, her eyes steady on the Mustang. She had seen this before, the anger, the fear, but what most didn't understand was that it wasn't the rage that needed taming. It was the fear. She held her ground, waiting, her breath slow and controlled. Rogue's movements were a whirlwind of wild energy, but Emma's stillness cut through the chaos like a calm in the eye of a storm. She didn't try to grab him, didn't try to force him into submission. She just waited. She let him come to her. Rogue thrashed against the ropes again, his eyes wild with panic, but as he paused, Emma could see something shift. A flicker of curiosity. His body was still tense, but he no longer had the raw, unrelenting fury that had driven him to fight every other time. The spark of curiosity was small, but it was there. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what they were witnessing. No one had ever held Rogue's attention like this, not without force, not without domination. But Emma didn't need to dominate him. She just needed to be there, calm and patient, waiting for him to trust her. And slowly, Rogue took a hesitant step forward. Each failed attempt by the ranchers only seemed to fuel the tension in the air, a thick, almost tangible weight that pressed down on Summit Hollow. The once mocking laughter from the crowd had turned into uneasy murmurs. One by one, the men tried to tame Rogue, but each time they approached with their ropes and whips, the Mustang reacted violently. He thrashed, kicked, and reared up, his hooves pounding the ground with a force that shook the earth beneath them. The air was filled with the sharp crack of whips and the harsh sound of commands shouted in vain. With every failed attempt, the skepticism in the crowd grew. They didn't believe Emma could do it. They had seen what Rogue was capable of, his strength, his defiance, and they thought her methods were nothing more than foolishness. But Emma didn't flinch. She stood at the edge of the pen, her eyes never leaving the Mustang, watching with a quiet intensity that was far beyond her years. Rogue was wild, but he wasn't evil. Emma could see that. Beneath the ferocity, there was something deeper, something more fragile. His eyes filled with fury one moment, would soften the next, only to snap back into defense mode when the men approached. It wasn't hatred that drove his violence. It was fear, fear of being controlled, fear of being hurt again. As one of the ranchers pulled back, breathless and defeated, Emma stepped forward. She had already seen enough to know that the others didn't understand. They thought strength was measured in force, in how much you could make the horse submit. But Emma knew better. She had learned from years of caring for animals that gentleness, patience, and trust were the keys. She wasn't there to break Rogue. She was there to help him heal. "Rogue," she whispered softly, stepping closer to the pen. "I'm not here to hurt you. You don't have to fight." Her voice was steady, calm, a stark contrast to the storm that had been raging in the pen. Rogue's eyes flickered toward her, and for a split second, Emma saw the hesitation. But it was brief, so brief that she almost missed it. His distrust ran deep, and even with her gentle voice, she knew it wouldn't be easy to win his trust. But Emma didn't back down. She didn't need his trust right away. She just needed him to know she wouldn't hurt him, that she wouldn't force him to do anything he wasn't ready for. She continued to speak, her words slow and deliberate, offering peace in a world that had only given him chaos. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you," she repeated. The crowd had grown quiet now, the earlier jeers replaced by an eerie silence. They watched in stunned disbelief as Emma slowly, methodically, moved toward Rogue, her hands still open and unthreatening. The tension in the air had shifted, no longer a pressure to break the Mustang, but a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the girl's patience would win where force had failed. The crowd held its breath, a collective gasp rising into the air as Rogue's hooves shifted in the dirt. For a moment, it felt as if the entire world had paused, time suspended, the noise of the town swallowed by the tension in the pen. Rogue, the Mustang that had never taken a step toward anyone, took one hesitant step toward Emma. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. His eyes were still filled with wariness, his body coiled in a way that spoke of 1,000 battles fought and lost. But his muscles, which had once been taut with resistance, seemed to soften just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The crowd was silent now, no longer mocking but unsure, their eyes wide in disbelief. They had never seen this before. They had never seen anyone approach Rogue without force, without threats. They had never seen anyone get this close, let alone earn his trust. The men who had bet against Emma, who had laughed at the idea of a little girl taming a wild beast, were now watching with rapt attention. Emma could feel the weight of the moment, the sharpness of Rogue's gaze as he took another tentative step forward. His nostrils flared, the sound of his breath coming in slow, controlled bursts. Every instinct in her told her to wait, to let him come to her on his own terms. She didn't want to rush him. She didn't want to push him further away. Slowly, Emma breathed in deeply, exhaling in a long, steady stream. Her hand, which had been hovering at her side, moved forward, palm open and fingers relaxed. She kept her body low, non-threatening, as though she too were waiting for him to decide if he could trust her. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "I won't hurt you. You're safe." The Mustang's body twitched, then stilled. His gaze never left hers, and for the first time, Emma saw something in those wild eyes that wasn't anger or fear. It was curiosity. There was still hesitation in the way he moved, but it was a different kind of hesitation. It was no longer the wild, unpredictable energy of a creature that fought to escape. It was the hesitation of a being who had lived through pain, who had learned to distrust everything and everyone. And yet, here was a small, quiet girl, offering nothing but calm and understanding. Rogue's body language softened further, his head dipping slightly, and he took another cautious step toward her. It was a small step, but it felt like the world had shifted beneath their feet. Emma's breath caught in her throat, a wave of relief flooding over her. She could feel it now, the connection between them, fragile but real. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their disbelief turning to something else. Hope, perhaps. They were witnessing the impossible. Emma's patience, her gentleness, slowly winning over the wild heart of a Mustang who had never trusted anyone. The crowd, once silent in awe, began to stir as Emma continued her quiet approach toward Rogue. Her movements were slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the rushed energy of the ranchers who had tried and failed before her. Rogue had taken another step toward her, and for the first time the Mustang seemed to be relaxing. His body, which had once been a coiled spring of defiance, was now just slightly more at ease. Emma could feel the trust between them growing, fragile as it was, but with every second she sensed it deepening. Yet, as the minutes passed, impatience began to seep into the crowd. The ranchers, who had stood by watching her quiet persistence, started muttering among themselves. Emma could hear their voices rising, the tension in the air shifting. "This is taking too long," one of them grumbled. "You can't just wait around all day for a horse to come to you. You've got to show him who's boss." Another chimed in, shaking his head. "She's too soft. You can't tame a wild animal like that. You've got to break him. Make him submit." Emma's heart twisted, but she didn't let the words penetrate her calm. She had heard it all before, the idea that strength could only come from force. The belief that to dominate, to control, was the only way to win. They didn't understand. They didn't see what she saw in Rogue's eyes. The Mustang wasn't angry. He wasn't wild out of malice. He was wild because he was terrified, and fear could never be conquered by force. The ranchers' voices grew louder, urging her to move faster, pushing for her to take control. "You'll never win this bet if you don't hurry it up," one of them said, his voice thick with derision. "You're wasting time. He's just gonna keep pushing you away. You've got to get tough with him." Emma could feel the weight of their words like a pressure on her chest, but she refused to let them sway her. She had made a promise to herself, and more importantly to Rogue. This wasn't about the bet. It was about the connection between them, and she would not risk breaking it by rushing. Her gaze remained fixed on the Mustang. His body was still tense, but there was a subtle softness to him now, a change that no one else seemed to see. Rogue wasn't ready yet. He needed more time, more space. Emma knew that pushing him too hard, too fast, would undo everything they had built. "Easy, Rogue," she murmured again, her voice a steady thread through the rising doubts. "It's okay. You don't have to be afraid. You can trust me." She didn't answer the ranchers. She didn't need to. Her attention was on the horse, on the quiet but powerful bond they were forming. She knew this was the only way, the right way, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her believe otherwise. The air seemed to still as Rogue took another step, this one slower than the others, more deliberate. Emma's heart raced, but her body remained as calm as ever. His hooves moved cautiously across the dirt, each step measured as though he were testing the ground between them. His wild, piercing gaze never left her, and Emma could feel the weight of his uncertainty. It was as if he were asking permission to trust her, to take this step into the unknown. The crowd, which had been murmuring with impatience just moments before, now held its breath. Emma's every movement was watched with the kind of intensity that made the world outside the pen feel distant. The ranchers, who had once mocked her, were now silent, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had seen men try and fail to tame Rogue. But here she was, this quiet little girl who had offered nothing but calm words and patient presence, and the Mustang was responding. Emma's fingers twitched, and without a second thought, she knelt down. Her hand, open and steady, moved slowly toward the ground, offering him peace. The gesture was simple, but it held everything she had been waiting for, the patience, the trust, the promise that she wasn't there to break him, but to understand him. For a moment, the pen was utterly silent, save for the soft sound of Emma's breath and the occasional snort from Rogue. Then, as if guided by some invisible force, the Mustang lowered his head, his dark mane brushing against the dirt. Emma's hand was just within reach, and with a tentative step, he nuzzled it. His nostrils flared, his breath warm against her skin. It wasn't the wild, frantic movement she had expected, but a gentle touch, a moment of connection. For that fleeting second, something in Rogue's eyes shifted. The rage, the fear, the untamed energy that had once been a wall between them softened. It wasn't gone, not entirely. There was still a part of him that held back, but Emma could see it now. Beneath the layers of resistance, there was something else, something vulnerable, something that had been buried for so long, hidden beneath the fight for survival. The crowd, too, seemed to feel it. The murmurs of disbelief began to spread, but this time they were filled with awe. No one could understand it, but they could see it. The impossible was happening before their eyes. Emma remained still, her hand gently resting on the ground, feeling Rogue's breath against her skin. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a breakthrough. And in that moment, everything felt like it had changed. Rogue was no longer the untamable force he had once been. For the first time, he wasn't resisting. He was simply there. And so was she. Together. Emma stood in the pen, her gaze never leaving Rogue. The crowd had fallen into a hushed silence, their eyes fixed on the unfolding moment, but Emma barely noticed them. She didn't care about the bets anymore, or the whispers of doubt that still lingered in the air. She had come here to do something far more important than win a wager. She had come to understand Rogue, to break through the invisible chains that bound his spirit. The realization hit her quietly, like the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness. This wasn't just about taming a Mustang. It wasn't about proving the ranchers wrong, or earning the respect of a town that had written her off from the start. No, it was about something deeper. It was about the bond between them, two beings who had been misunderstood and underestimated, yet somehow, in this moment, were finding their way to each other. Rogue stood just a few feet away, his body still tense but no longer wild. He wasn't the same horse who had reared up in defiance, kicking against the ropes and fighting with every ounce of his being. Now there was a calm in his movements, a softness to the way he held himself, as though he too was beginning to understand that Emma wasn't a threat. She wasn't there to control him, she was there to listen, to wait, to help him find peace. The connection between them grew stronger with every passing second. It wasn't something that could be rushed, but Emma could feel it. She could feel Rogue's trust building, like a fragile thread woven between them. Every moment of calm, every soft word, every slow, deliberate step she took toward him was breaking down the walls that had kept him captive for so long. The fear, the pain, the mistrust, piece by piece, it was all starting to fade away. Emma's quiet strength, the kind that had always been within her but never fully seen, began to shine through. She didn't need to force anything. She didn't need to push him into submission. She simply needed to be there, present and steady, offering him the patience and understanding he had never received before. And as she stood there, her hand gently outstretched toward Rogue, the townsfolk began to see it, too. They had been watching from the sidelines, skeptical and impatient, but now they saw something far greater unfolding before them. This wasn't just a little girl trying to tame a wild horse. This was a true connection being forged, a bond of trust and mutual respect that went beyond anything they had ever expected. Rogue took another step closer, his eyes softening, his body relaxing just enough to show that he wasn't just submitting, he was choosing to trust. The impossible was happening, and for the first time, Emma knew it wasn't about winning. It was about the journey they were on together. And that journey had only just begun. As the minutes passed, Emma's calm presence seemed to shift the very air around her. The crowd, once filled with laughter and skepticism, was now quieter, more expectant. Rogue's body language had softened, his movements slower, more deliberate. His eyes no longer held the same wild fury. Instead, there was a quiet trust that was beginning to form between them, fragile but undeniable. With every step he took toward Emma, the tension in the air seemed to fade, replaced by something else, a sense of possibility. But in the distance, Colton was watching, and his gaze was dark with growing frustration. The rancher had always prided himself on control, on power, domination, and forcing others to bend to his will. It had been his way for as long as anyone could remember, and now, as he watched a little girl, someone he deemed too soft, too weak, get closer to the impossible, something inside him began to snap. He could feel his reputation slipping, his authority crumbling with each step Emma and Rogue took toward each other. "No, this can't be happening," Colton muttered under his breath. His jaw tightened as he clenched his fists. He had tried everything, his ropes, his whips, his commands, but now here was Emma, doing the one thing he could never understand, letting the Mustang come to her. She was winning, not through force, but through patience, and it was driving him mad. With a sudden motion, Colton strode toward the pen, his boots kicking up dust as he approached. His eyes never left Rogue, who was now within a few feet of Emma, his body calm and relaxed, the wildness that once defined him fading into something gentler. Colton reached the edge of the pen, his voice sharp and full of authority. "You're doing it wrong," he barked, his words cutting through the air like a whip. "This is how it's done," he added, motioning to the men with ropes who had been standing by, ready to step in. "You can't just stand there letting him come to you. He needs to be taught who's in charge." Emma didn't flinch. She knew exactly what Colton was trying to do. His methods, force, intimidation, control, had never worked with Rogue, but they had worked for Colton, and he couldn't stand the idea of someone like Emma proving him wrong. He needed to show the crowd that it wasn't the gentle touch that worked. It was the power of domination. With a heavy sigh, Emma stood still, her eyes locked on Rogue, ignoring Colton's angry words. She couldn't let him interfere. She couldn't let him break the fragile connection they had worked so hard to build. Rogue turned his gaze toward Colton, his body tensing slightly at the intrusion. Emma spoke softly, her voice steady but firm. "It's okay, Rogue," she whispered. "He's not going to hurt you. You're safe here." For a brief heart-stopping moment, Rogue seemed to hesitate. Then, slowly, he turned back toward Emma, his eyes softening. The trust was still there, unbroken. And as the final moments of the bet approached, Emma's quiet approach won out, the power of patience and understanding proving far stronger than anything Colton could ever force. The timer was ticking down, its seconds slipping away like sand in an hourglass. The air was thick with anticipation, the crowd holding their collective breath, the tension rising with each passing moment. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but her movements were steady. She had made it this far, and now, with only moments left in the bet, she couldn't rush it. She knew that the last step, this final moment, had to come on its own terms, and she had to wait for it, just as she had waited for everything else. Rogue was standing only a few feet from her now, his body still tense, but not with the same violent energy that had driven him to fight for so long. His head was slightly lowered, his nostrils flaring as he breathed in the scent of the dry earth beneath them. He was still wary, still unsure, but Emma could feel it. The connection between them was stronger than ever, fragile but real. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the earlier mockery replaced by something far deeper, something that could only be described as awe. Rogue, the Mustang who had never let anyone close without a fight, was standing still, his eyes locked on Emma's, no longer filled with fury. He was beginning to trust her. Emma slowly extended her hand, not forcefully, not with expectation, but with the kind of quiet offering that had gotten them this far. Her palm was open, her fingers relaxed. She wasn't demanding anything. She wasn't reaching for control. She was offering peace. She was offering trust. "Come on, Rogue," she whispered, her voice a soft thread of sound in the stillness. "It's okay. You don't have to fight anymore." The seconds seemed to stretch on forever, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her hand hovered just a few inches from his shoulder, and for a long moment, Rogue didn't move. He stood still, his body as taut as a bowstring, his dark eyes locked with hers. It felt like the entire world was waiting for him to make the choice. And then, as though some invisible barrier had been lifted, Rogue took a slow, deliberate step toward her. His body, which had been coiled with fear and resistance, seemed to relax, just slightly. His head lowered even further, and with a trembling breath, he allowed Emma's hand to touch his shoulder. The crowd gasped in unison, the sound of it rippling through the air like a wave. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she felt the warmth of his coat beneath her fingertips. This was it. This was the moment. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision as she stood there, her hand on Rogue's shoulder, feeling the wild Mustang, once a symbol of defiance, once untamable, accept her touch. For a fleeting moment, everything else faded away. It was just her and Rogue, in this quiet, beautiful understanding. The impossible had happened, and Emma had done it, not by force, not by control, but by patience, trust, and the belief that kindness could reach even the wildest of hearts. The moment Emma's hand rested on Rogue's shoulder, something shifted, not just between them, but in the air around them, in the very heart of Summit Hollow. The wild Mustang, who had once been the embodiment of defiance, now stood still, his body relaxed, his eyes soft. It was as if the years of struggle, of fighting, of resistance had melted away in the warmth of Emma's touch. The impossible had happened. The wild, untamable creature had allowed her in, and the bond that had formed between them was undeniable. The crowd remained frozen in stunned silence, their eyes wide as they watched the transformation unfold before them. The ranchers, who had once scoffed at Emma's approach, now stood speechless, their skepticism replaced by something else, a quiet awe. The old ways of dominance and force that they had clung to for so long suddenly seemed hollow. The very foundation of their beliefs was cracking before their eyes. Colton, who had been standing off to the side, his arms crossed in disbelief, couldn't tear his gaze away. His face, usually set in a mask of confidence and control, was now filled with a mixture of frustration and something else, something that resembled doubt. He had tried everything to break Rogue, to show the town that strength could only come from force. And now, in the silence of the pen, he was watching a little girl do what he had failed to accomplish, simply by being patient and gentle. The town had always believed in power, the kind of power that came from dominance, from bending others to your will. They had watched as the ranchers struggled, tried, and failed, each one adding to the myth of Rogue's untamability. But now, they were seeing something else. They were seeing a new kind of strength, the kind that didn't come from force, but from understanding. As Emma stood there, her hand still resting on Rogue's shoulder, she felt the weight of the transformation settling over her. It wasn't just the Mustang that had changed, it was everything. The once distant ranchers who had never seen the value of gentleness were beginning to see it. The town that had always favored control was beginning to realize that there was power in trust, in patience, in kindness. Rogue, the embodiment of wildness and resistance, now stood quietly beside Emma, his body at ease. The bond between them was clear, a silent understanding that had reshaped everything. The crowd, which had once doubted Emma, now watched in reverence. They had seen the strength it took to approach the wild, to break through the walls of fear and resistance with nothing but patience, and in that moment, the town's perception of strength, power, and control was forever altered. Emma didn't speak. She didn't need to. The quiet transformation between her and Rogue had said everything. And as the town began to shift, so too did the way they would see themselves, no longer bound by the old ways, but free to embrace a new kind of strength. A strength built on trust, on gentleness, and on the quiet, unwavering belief that kindness could change the world. The crowd had slowly dispersed, their murmurs and whispers fading into the distance, leaving the square quiet and still. The once chaotic pen, now empty of spectators, seemed to hold a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. Emma stood in the middle, her hand gently resting on Rogue's shoulder. The Mustang, once a creature of untamed fury, now stood beside her quietly, his head lowered, his breathing steady. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and for the first time since the challenge had begun, Emma felt the tension leave her body. She hadn't won the bet, not in the way people thought of victory. She hadn't broken Rogue. She hadn't tamed him with force. She had simply offered him understanding, a quiet space where trust could bloom. And now, as she stood alone with him, it was clear that something profound had happened, not just between them, but for the entire town. Rogue nickered softly, nudging her arm, his touch light, like a reassurance. Emma's heart swelled with a quiet pride. She had done it, not for herself, not for the crowd, but for him. For the Mustang who had been misunderstood, for the wild creature who had taught her more about patience than she could ever have imagined. From the edge of the pen, Emma's grandfather, Walter, watched. His weathered face had been a mixture of concern and disbelief when Emma had stepped into the pen earlier that day. But now, as he took in the sight before him, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. The man who had raised her, who had seen so much in life, was witnessing something remarkable, something that would change not just Emma, but the entire town. Without a word, Walter walked over to Emma, his steps slow but steady. His hands were rough, worn by years of hard work, but as he reached her, he placed one hand on her shoulder. His gaze was soft, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. "You did it, Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed them." Emma didn't speak at first, simply nodding. Her grandfather's approval, his pride, was more than enough. They stood there together for a moment, the only sounds the soft rustle of the wind and the distant clink of horses' hooves on the dirt. The town may never be the same. It was still too early to know the full impact of what had happened, but Emma had done something extraordinary. She had shown them all that true strength wasn't about control, it wasn't about domination, it was about understanding, about the quiet strength of patience, the power of trust. And as Emma stood with Rogue, the first real friend she had ever had, she knew that her journey was only beginning. It wasn't just the Mustang that had been set free that day. It was the town itself, ready to embrace a new way forward, built on the kind of strength that Emma had just demonstrated. A strength that didn't break but healed, didn't fight but listened, And for the first time in a long time, Summit Hollow had hope. If Emma's story has inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button and share this powerful tale of patience, trust and transformation with others. Subscribe to stay updated on more heartwarming stories that remind us of the true strength in kindness and understanding. What do you think? Could you tame the wild with patience? Let us know in the comments below.